You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Selene Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. I hope you all are well. So there are a few topics that come up on a regular basis in our community, and among the top of those topics is blood sugar. Women tell me all the time that they have been sailing through their lives, not thinking much about their blood sugar until they hit the menopause transition, and suddenly a doctor tells them they have prediabetes. And I did a whole show on that very phenomenon with Val Schonberg, aptly called What to Know About Prediabetes and Menopause. And if you haven't checked that one out, I really encourage you to do so. She is a real expert on that topic and explains it very clearly. I'll link it in the show notes. It's also really calming for the nerves, if I must say so myself. So check that one out. And then this week, I wanted to dive in again and really talk about all the factors that influence blood sugar, because we do tend to be laser focused on carbohydrates, on sugars, on starches. And I see women all the time telling me that they are cutting out carbs, and that can actually make blood sugar worse, which is something I have experienced personally. Other factors that can make it worse include chronic stress, poor sleep, rushing through our meals, lots of sitting, grazing, underfueling our workouts, tons of stuff. So I get into all of it with this week's guest, Liz McKinney, who heads up the clinical nutrition team at NutriSense. Liz has a Master of Science degree in clinical nutrition and integrative health. She is a board-certified nutrition specialist, and she just works with a lot of women in our demographic. She's also really great at explaining this stuff. I loved talking to her, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did, because I really, really enjoyed it. All right, before we get to it, give us a follow at Feisty Menopause on Instagram and Facebook. Come on in and join our private Hit Play Not Pause Facebook group, and head into those show notes and sign up for my free weekly Feisty 40 Plus newsletter with all the training, nutrition, and lifestyle news you can use. If you like the show, do me a favor, drop 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts, and even better, share it with a friend. It really does help the show continue to grow. All right, enough of me. Let's have a few words about our awesome sponsors and get on with the show. All right, Liz, welcome to the show. Another show for me on blood glucose, which, as I explained to you before I hit record, is something that as a athlete, many years I was interested in, looking early when they were trying to decide if we could use CGMs as like fuel gauges, which probably didn't pan out the way people thought it might. And then now in this population, women going through perimenopause into, postmenopause, and what that looks like when they're looking at their blood sugar. So I think this is a topic that is going to be ongoing for quite a while, but I'm looking forward to adding some more information in this show with you. So thanks.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to be here. I could talk about blood sugar and CGM use and all of that stuff all day. So it's just going to be another fun convo for me.
So let's set the table and talk about what blood glucose really is. Where does it come from? What levels we like to see? Because I think people, when they think about it, they think, oh, it's the sugar we eat. But it's so much more complicated than that.
It sure is, yes. But I think when we put it very, very simply, glucose is the body's preferred fuel source. No matter how you want to frame it, it's the brain and the muscles want to use glucose. Our muscles are just huge sinks for glucose. And so, yes, glucose comes from the food we eat in the form of carbohydrates, but it also comes from protein. Certain fatty acids can be turned into glucose. And then we have our stored carbohydrates. So our liver stores carbohydrates in the form of something called glycogen, which is just long chains of glucose. So we not only consume carbohydrates in the form of glucose, but we also can store it and break it down when it's necessary. And then we get into the whole thing with, if you're eating a low carb diet, you're still creating glucose, like your liver has a process called gluconeogenesis, which is just a fancy way of saying we're creating new glucose. And so the body's really smart. It's like, if you're not feeding me carbohydrates, then I'm going to turn amino acids and I'm going to turn fatty acids into glucose so that I can fuel my brain and my muscles. It is metabolically our preferred fuel source.
And as the active audience that we're talking to, many of whom are endurance athletes, I mean, we try to stuff our glycogen stores, our muscle glycogen stores. We're sort of acutely aware of that. And I've been following, this is not a show about that, but sort of the whole, there was a time at which we thought like, well, maybe all endurance athletes could, because we're going in that fat burning area for so long, we could just exist on that. And that didn't really pan out the way, people wanted it to either. So yeah.
Sure. And it is so highly individual. And I think I come back around to that so often, is that especially with the athlete population, you do see small studies where, high fat, low carb athletes can excel, but we just don't have enough rigorous data to suggest that we should turn years and years of research around how important carbohydrates are to fueling on its head. So yes, you can see those athletes that really do thrive on a high fat diet, and there's probably some genetic metabolic difference in play there that will hopefully be very interesting to unpack. But I am still of the mindset that, especially for active women, we shouldn't be afraid of carbohydrates. We really need them.
So you said in another show I was listening to that we're doing carbohydrates a disservice when we put them into one bucket. So speaking of unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah. So carbohydrates are not all created equal, and that's probably not going to come as a surprise, especially to your audience. So we know that 20 grams of carbs from junk food is not the same as 20 grams of carbs from a sweet potato. So that is far, and that's sort of common knowledge. I think from there, right, we're looking at fiber. We're also going to be looking at how your individual body processes carbohydrates. So I've done experiments myself, and I've seen lots and lots of our members do experiments where they'll eat 25 grams of carbs from a sweet potato, and they'll eat 25 grams of carbs from another equally high fiber source of carb, and have completely different responses to it. And there's been a lot of really interesting research and studies done on that, where they have identically genetic people, so they'll have identical twins consume the same types of carbohydrates, and even they will have different responses to that carbohydrate in terms of their blood glucose. So yes, from a nutritional standpoint, they're not all created equal, but then also how your body breaks that down and uses it is going to be different. And that's could be you're eating it at a different time of day, and we'll get into the circadian rhythm.
Yeah, I was going to ask
too,
that.
but yeah, time of day, how active you are, if you've slept well the night before, if there's stress going on. So it can offer a layer of frustration, I will say, for some of our members who will eat the same breakfast day in, day out, have a great response to those carbohydrates in that meal. And then the next day, all of a sudden, that 10th time they eat it, they're having a spike. So being able to understand sort of that nuances and understand how much lifestyle and for women too, hormonal fluctuations and all of that is so important when we're looking at how our body processes those carbs.
Yeah, I was going to bring this up later, but you mentioned it. When I would do experiments with the CGMs that I have done, one of the most remarkable revelations to me was really how much stress had an impact. Because as you know, I could eat the same meal that I would either think or would not think would be spiking my blood sugar. And if I was chilled and hanging out and I had some pad thai or whatever, like sometimes the level would be just pretty gentle. And if I was on the phone, stressed out at my desk, working through stuff, it was a whole different reaction.
Yeah. And even how fast we eat. So that was something new that came out a couple of years ago, was that they've done some studies about just the rate of consumption of food can impact
Oh, interesting.
how glucose will respond to things, which I thought was crazy. So, I'll see members who will eat a pretty low carb lunch and they'll kind of get a crazy spike. And I'm sort of like, well, let's kind of like take a step back and think, what was going on at that time. And sometimes I was in a meeting, I was eating at my desk, I was wolfing my food down, and that can have a big impact. So we kind of have to say, let's try to settle when we're eating. Let's try to eat without distraction. Take a couple deep breaths, activate that, that vagus nerve, and just kind of try to put yourself in that rest and digest. We want to activate that parasympathetic nervous system. If our sympathetic nervous system is crazy, we're going to see that impact with glucose.
And when I hear people say things like that, it always little bells go off thinking this is why traditional ways that people have done things appear to be so healthy that we're always trying to unpack in other ways. Like when you just sit down to a meal and it's relaxed with a bunch of your friends, what's on the table may sometimes not matter quite as much all the time as how it's going on, how everything is.
And I think that adds a aspect of freedom. And I think that's when we're looking at CGM, it's always that empowerment because you're gaining knowledge and you're learning. It's never a judgment. It's not a moral compass. It's just learning and trying not to get caught up in feeling very chained to the data or feeling like I can never eat a food that isn't nutritionally dense or whatever it is. And to your point, I mean, look at Spain and France, and they're sitting eating, paella and drinking wine for hours and hours. And I would be very curious how
hours. I was just there on a bike trip. Hours. I mean, like it was like
yes,
literally 3 hours. Like, are we done with
and
dinner?
it's kind of like, are we rushing our meals? Are we rushing our meals? Are we chewing our food well? The things that we don't really think about when it comes to even glucose. We got to start kind of thinking outside the box with some of those things.
So what is the deal with spikes? I feel like I've had this conversation a few times and maybe didn't drill into that quite as much as I should have or wanted to. Is the spike itself a concern? Is it how long it stays elevated? Is it how many you have in a day? What are we talking about when we talk about that concern?
Yeah. So I think when I'm looking at someone's glucose patterns, I never want anyone to be concerned that they have a one-off spike from a meal. It's more about the duration and frequency, which you sort of hinted at. So it is normal for glucose to go up when we eat. Glucose is never going to be a flat line. We don't want it to be a flat line. We also don't want to demonize insulin because we really need it. It's like it's a Goldilocks effect. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. We want it right in the middle. We want just enough. Insulin is a super important anabolic hormone. So I hate when people demonize insulin or, they're like, oh, you shouldn't ever have a spike. Your glucose should be a flat line. That is just not what we would ever expect to see. So we want glucose to fluctuate. That is what a normal picture looks like. A spike in and of itself, every once in a while, is not harmful. And even when we think about muscle building, we need insulin to do that. And so, right when glucose goes up, we want insulin to do its job and bring it into our muscles and the liver. It becomes a problem when it's the duration and the frequency. So we don't want glucose to stay elevated for a really long time. So that would be like having a high average glucose. Usually when that happens, it's a couple of different things come to mind. You can be grazing. So somebody that's eating small amounts over the entire course of the day, they might see kind of a higher elevated glucose because glucose never comes down to baseline before they're eating again. So that can be one pattern. The other pattern is if there's stress at play. So if you're kind of under some chronic stress, we can see not only more spikes, but also just kind of a higher average, day over day. And then, stress, which is in of itself a stressor on the body sleep, which lack of sleep in and of itself can be a big stressor on the body. So we kind of see those patterns, but we do know that having more glycemic variability, which is the swings in your glucose over the course of the day. So just a fancy way of saying like how much your glucose is fluctuating. It's called glycemic variability. We know that having a much higher glycemic variability, which means your glucose is going up and down in a pretty significant way all day long, having a higher GV, glycemic variability, is more detrimental to your body and linked to worse health outcomes than just having a higher average glucose.
Oh,
So
interesting.
we want to work on both of those. But when I see this kind of interplay of the two, if we work on glycemic variability and reducing the fluctuations, you're almost always going to see that average come down as well. So that's why we look at things like time in range and glycemic variability, because it looks at not just one spike, but it looks at how much of that week, how many times were you out of range in that week. And we like to see 95% of the time for a healthy person that is non-diabetic in between that 70 to 140 range.
That's the range.
Yeah.
Okay. So that brings me to a population that could be exercising or training 15 hours a week sometimes, or doing very high intensity training, talking about CrossFit athletes, ultra endurance athletes going long. They often are out of that range. Sometimes I have worked with companies looking at blood sugar and CGM that want you to be out of that range sometimes. I shared with you before I hit record that sometimes I would overlay my glucose response, my glucose journey with my journey that I had taken on my bike, and they looked pretty close, like the ups and the downs. So where does that come into this picture?
Yeah. So I think, again, we kind of chatted about this before you hit record, but for active individuals, CGMs are really fascinating, but they can be confusing. And I think they can be kind of frustrating as well. So I think from a basic standpoint, exercise spikes are normal. Basically, what's happening is your liver is releasing glucose to fuel muscle contractions. All it's saying is, hey, I need to release glucose because there's a demand for it. It's a non-insulin mediated spike. So,
Right.
right, exercising muscle can pull glucose in for its use. And so it's not going to be a metabolically damaging spike the way you would think of a spike from food might be,
Interesting.
because that one
Hmm.
is insulin mediated. So from that standpoint, totally fine. We can see glucose go up fairly high in some workouts. When we're getting over 180 consistently, we may want to think about fueling properly,
Mm,
because that can still cause vascular damage. It can still cause damage to the microvasculature and to your blood vessels. Think of glucose as kind of being like little pins in your bloodstream. And so that can cause problems when glucose is high that way. Even though it's a insulin mediated spike, it can still cause some, like I said, vascular damage. So when we see glucose that's going really, really high, I'm thinking of a few things. What's fueling look like? Are you fueling properly so that the liver doesn't have to compensate as much? So are we able to think about fueling? Are we looking at hydration? What's dehydration? What's the rate of sweat look like? Things like that can all cause glucose to sort of go up in a high manner. So depending on your current energy status, when we see glucose go up in exercise, it can come from a variety of sources or a mix of sources. So if you're in a fasted workout, your liver and muscles are breaking down glycogen to provide the energy that you need for that workout. If you have eaten, so for an endurance athlete or somebody that is fueling after doing several hours of exercise, you're going to be using a combo of the food you're eating and what is being released from your liver. So I think when I see somebody that has some pretty significant exercise spikes going on and they're, training long hours, or they're on a course where they're exercising for hours at a time, we do want to look at what's fueling like, right? How many carbs are you taking in? Are you repleting sodium, electrolytes? Are you hydrated? How was sleep the night before? How was stress? So you kind of have to dig in when you start to see some spikes. But metabolically, they are not the same as a spike that comes from sitting on your couch and eating, a bag of potato chips. So I think making that differentiation is super helpful for an active audience. So I think starting there is usually a good place to start.
that was an outstanding explanation of all that. And it also mirrors some of what I have said over the years. Like, I've been around a long time in the sport and I've tried all the different things that people have recommended. And my blood sugar was considerably more problematic when I was trying to do those espresso rides, those fasted rides. It wasn't a pretty picture
Yeah.
as opposed to when I was actually fueling myself. And some people would think, well, that's counterintuitive, but it's actually not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also goes to the point of, as women age, I think we're done a disservice because we're told, well, you just need to exercise more and you need to eat less.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole extended fasting that women want to get into, and they see it working really well for men, or they're like, I'm going to do HIIT or CrossFit several times a week, and I'm going to also eat low carb, and I'm just going to cut out all these carbs. And I think we really do ourselves a disservice by doing that, because it ends up having the opposite impact. Men have a 24-hour hormonal cycle. So what works really well for a man is not going to work the same way for us. We are hormonal little anomalies, and so we have to take that into account. And so I have worked with women who, when they kind of start eating more carbs, they start actually eating more, and we kind of switch up how they're exercising, it ends up being a whole different ball game for them. But yeah, I think we have to stop being so afraid of carbs, especially as active
Yeah.
individuals. We really need them. And
What
I
is happening during Oh, I'm sorry.
no, I was just going to kind of go back to the exercise spike thing a little bit. And you had mentioned some people look at them as a fuel gauge, and I don't think we can. There's
I
always
think they wanted to, but
yeah,
yeah.
we wanted to, but it's more about patterns, I think. And then even there is that 5 to 10 minute delay, but I think we do pay a lot of attention to spikes that happen with exercise. We should also be paying attention to hypoglycemia
Mm.
exercise, and when glucose starts to go down. And I think there is that benefit of being able to say, what's my glucose looking like? When should I kind of start fueling? Where should I kind of start playing around with how many grams of carbs I'm taking in per hour? Am I seeing a corresponding glucose low when I am exercising? And then outside that realm, what's happening with overnight glucose? Are we recovering properly? Is our glucose going low overnight? Are we not able to replete our glycogen stores properly? So looking at that whole 24-hour picture as an athlete is really helpful, is super important, because we can end up having that reactive hypoglycemia. And so timing of fuel, I think, becomes an important piece of that. How soon are you eating before you're exercising? Are you kind of seeing that decline and kind of bonking early on in your session? And can we do something to kind of mitigate that from happening? So I think, yes, we want to pay attention to what's happening in actual exercise, but pre and post are also just as important when we're looking at that data too.
So, one question on that before I sort of slide into some of the other things you said is what, because I have heard people talk about drops overnight and waking up because they have some sort of drop in their blood sugar. What are we looking for of it overnight specifically?
Sure. So we want an even glucose. There is not a lot of scientific evidence to suggest what glucose should be on average overnight. We sort of line it up with a healthy average glucose over the course of 24 hours. So your average glucose, we like to see under 105 milligrams per deciliter. We like overnight glucose to be similar to that. But what I'm looking for with overnight glucose, especially in an athlete population, is what are you doing in the evening before you're going to sleep? And if you are eating right before you're going to bed, which can be helpful in some athletes' cases, we also don't want glucose to be really, really high either, because that's going to impact melatonin secretion and all kinds of things with your circadian rhythm. So again, it's sort of finding that sweet spot. When glucose does go low, right, you can have that nocturnal hypoglycemia, and that's going to wake you up. It's also going to, have an impact on how we are building muscle and what kind of or what type of energy we're using overnight. So I do think it's helpful to look at that pattern so you can say, how can I reorganize my evening routine, whether that's having a snack before bed or things like that. And it is super different in terms of what works well for some people. Some people do great with some carbs before bed. Other people do better with some protein. And so that kind of, we start to talk about experimentation and any one at that point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what is happening during the menopause transition when we're looking about insulin and carbohydrate sensitivity and or resistance?
So I think it's important to challenge this narrative that we're told, and I do think it is changing, which I'm very happy about, but our hormones are changing. It's not a breakdown, it's not a disease state. It's not something that can or even should be avoided. It's just about changing the playbook. We just have to switch up what we're doing, and this should be a normal part of a woman's journey. It shouldn't be something that you feel like I have to get through, or I have to fight with my doctor, or I'm feeling so miserable and I can't wait for it to be over. I think there's a different narrative that can be built around this. But I think the first step in that process is letting women know that they're not broken. This is not a disease state. This is just a normal thing that happens, and we have a lot of things in our control to sort of change this. But I think understanding what is happening in your body is important. And I think a lot of people don't get that information. And they're just kind of told, well, sorry, you should, just start exercising more and eat less, and, you'll lose weight. And it's just a very frustrating byline. So, right, estrogen and progesterone are playing super significant roles in insulin sensitivity and muscle fuel use. So as estrogen starts to decline, we're going to see a little bit of also a decline in our muscles anabolic response. So estrogen activates pathways like mTOR, which is stimulating our muscle protein synthesis after exercise and through protein intake. It's also supporting just kind of metabolic use. So estrogen is linked to higher insulin sensitivity. So as estrogen starts to decline, you're going to see a little bit of a bump in insulin resistance, which is why a lot of women start to see A1C creep up or fasting glucose creep up. We're also seeing estrogen have a huge impact in mitochondrial biogenesis, so creating new mitochondria. That's going to help with endurance, energy metabolism. It promotes fat oxidation. So through all of this, we kind of start to see a decline in all of the things that we were like, oh, wow, all through my 20s and 30s, I was cruising, I felt great, all this stuff. And then to kind of feel like the brakes have been pumped a little bit. So women who are starting to see these hormonal fluctuations, they are going to notice a little bit more variability in glucose responses, maybe some stubborn weight gain. They're noticing a little bit more visceral fat, so like fat around their organs. And so I think it just becomes, and I think a lot of women, as they enter this phase of life, have been told all their lives that all you need to do to lose weight is to eat in a caloric deficit and to exercise more. And so they come to us with this very deep-seated narrative, and it's hard to change. It's hard to change your mindset around that.
So how do you help them?
Yeah.
Because they are seeing, that all of those things that you're talking about is true. And I'd like to throw in there, what do they maybe misunderstand about the relationship between carbs, insulin, and fat storage?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also with CGM use in a non-diabetic population and sort of the rise of the ketogenic diet or a low carb diet, we do see a lot more of this carb, insulin, fat storage thought process where, we say, well, when you eat carbs, insulin's going to store them as fat. And it's just not as simple as that. I think we've really oversimplified that. I think it's always just going to be an excess of energy. Sure, carbs get stored as fat when they're in excess, but as long as you have room in your muscles and your liver, it's going to get stored as glycogen. So for a less active population, that they're just kind of starting to come to this, yeah, that makes sense. We're like, okay, there is an excess of carbohydrates. They're hanging out in your liver and your muscles. We got to start moving. We got to start emptying out the cubby hole, start using what you have stored. And that's where, yeah, extended fasting, low carb diets can really come in handy. But for a very active population, I think it's more about, okay, what's missing? What can we add in versus what are we taking away? So protein, I think you probably know this, is it's, to me, almost the most important macronutrient to be tracking. So when someone comes to me and they're like, I want to start tracking my macros, and maybe they're new to it, I said, we're going to do protein only first. We're going to track protein. We're going to make sure you're getting enough. And then everything else we kind of fill in the gaps. So for women who are in this life stage, the RDA for protein, I'm still waiting for it to change, because I'm like, this is the minimum amount that you need to survive. And let's start optimizing it. So like 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram for women who are active in this population, super important. Let's start there. Are you even getting enough protein, right? Protein alone stimulates muscle protein synthesis. It's a huge untapped source for improving our lean mass. So I think just that's step one, right? Are you getting your protein in before we even look at fiber, carbs, fat, any of that stuff? So we want to make sure that we're getting that protein for adequate muscle preservation, because that is the organ of longevity. I see you have Peter Attia's Outlive book back there. He is a huge proponent of this. Muscle is the organ of longevity. The more muscle mass we have, the longer we're going to live, the better we're going to feel.
I preach it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Not enough protein,
Yeah.
And even if somebody's having a hard time, I'm a big proponent of saying, let's fill the gaps, a protein powder, a protein shake. That's okay. If you're not getting it from food, which is obviously, that's the gold standard. We want to get our protein from food. But if somebody is really struggling, let's at least get the amount you need first. Yeah. We can fine tune and address from there.
And then you mentioned fiber, but I think fiber really deserves a bit more of a shining moment in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's abysmal. The average amount of fiber
it really is
that Americans are getting is very small. I think the last time I checked, it's like 10 or 15 grams per day, which is awful. And speaking of how important that is for women in menopause, you see cholesterol go up a lot in menopause because that mechanism is not working as well, clearing out cholesterol. And again, like the fatty acid oxidation, not working quite as well. So fiber is needed to bind up excess cholesterol and get rid of it. So when we're not eating enough fiber, cholesterol tends to go up because it's just circulating. So making sure you're getting enough fiber, and then also for gut health, right? For women, it's a whole other conversation to talk about the estrabolome, I think.
Yes, I never
called.
can say it well, but I know exactly what you're saying.
Yep. So
hormonal regulation in your gut.
Gut health for women in this life stage. We really want to focus on that too. If we don't have a healthy gut, metabolism is really going to suffer. We are still producing estrogen in this phase. It's just a different form of estrogen. And so we do still want to make sure that we are binding up excess estrogen and getting rid of it through that pathway. And fiber is the gold standard for that. So making sure that we are eating enough fiber. And then again, that's carbs too. So women who are doing low carb or ketogenic, really missing out on not just the fiber, but a lot of antioxidants, things that are going to help reduce oxidative stress in the body, which we already talked about, estrogen and the mitochondria connection. So it all kind of comes full circle. We need to be eating the things that are going to support overall gut health and overall metabolic health. And, fiber, plant foods, there's just no way around how good they are for us. There just isn't.
Is there a number you like people to shoot for?
It depends on where someone's coming in, because you don't want to totally.
You want to go right to 30. You don't want to go from 10 to 30 overnight.
Yes. So yeah, for women, 30-ish grams. For men, closer to 40. And it really does depend. I think taking a baseline, taking kind of a state of the union, say like, where are we sitting? And then we want to increase it from there. So I think it is important to talk about, gather that food log. Let's see what you're eating like for 7 days, and then we can tweak from there versus let's do an overhaul. That just, it
Yeah.
really overwhelms people. So, and then talking about the foods that they like that they can add in more. It's kind of the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
And then, also for women in this age group, I love seeds, right? So
Mm.
those fatty acids, um, flaxseed, chia seed, hemp seeds, keep them in the fridge, all ground up together in one. Put them on your yogurt, put them on salads, mix them into rice. Like, so many ways to get more fiber from nuts and seeds. So big untapped resource there. But yeah, 30 grams for women is technically is good, and then closer to 40 for men.
So where does when women are looking at their picture, let's say, I mean, we've talked about the range that you like to see. When we're looking at the hierarchy of things to look at, if you want to put it that way, where does A1C fit in the picture as opposed to fasting glucose, as opposed to like a glucose stress sort of thing? Like, what are we looking at there to really tell her the full
So
picture?
I do really think that, so I'll say this about CGM use. There is no lab marker for postprandial response to
Okay.
glucose currently. So there is the 2-hour glucose test that you can get when you're already kind of at that point where they think diabetes is at play, or if you're
Yeah.
pregnant, they're doing a glucose tolerance test. But in the real world, there isn't really a good way to see this. And so looking at postprandial, which is just fancy way of saying what happens to your glucose after you eat, there's really no other way besides using a CGM where we can see what's happening right after you eat. You can take a finger stick 2 hours after you eat and they want it to be under 140, but we're missing that whole chunk of time, right, without using the CGM. We also know that seeing hyperglycemia post meals is a really important predictor of metabolic dysfunction and having trouble with insulin sensitivity. So fasting insulin is going to be higher first. So even though the CGM isn't showing us what insulin looks like, if we have high glucose levels or we're really struggling with spikes that don't come down, that's a good indication that insulin is already high. So when we go to the doctor, not just fasting glucose might look fine. It's one little snapshot in time. It's impacted by so much. What did we eat the night before? Where are we in our hormonal cycle? Are we stressed out? Did we drink alcohol? Have you been exercising? Have you been sick? So lots of things play into a fasting glucose being higher, but it can also look just fine. And that's not always a good indication. So I think asking your doctor for a fasting insulin, we like it to be, between 2 and 8 for a fasting insulin. Looking at that, even if glucose is looking normal, when we have a fasting insulin, it's a red herring. We're like, oh, hey, this is kind of a red flag. We need to start looking at this a little bit closer. A1C is essentially a marker that looks at your average glucose over about 3 months. So it's
Hmm.
looking at the average amount of sugar that is stuck to your hemoglobin, red blood
Hmm.
cells. So there is some research to suggest that A1C is not a super sensitive marker. So it can be off depending on a lot of different things. I had anecdotally, I had a member once who we were doing all the things to help him. He was diagnosed type 2 diabetes, and his A1C was like not budging. It was not budging, even though we could see on his glucose meter that his sugars were coming down. And I was like, what is happening? Turns out that he had thalassemia, which is a form of like anemia, which was falsely raising his
Oh,
A1C.
interesting.
And and I was like, okay. So then they started doing other markers for him, right? Like, a C-peptide, or, I think it's fructosamine, or, something like that, where you get a better look. But I say that as it's not always the most useful marker. the more info, the better. So I'm always a proponent of getting it all, right? If you can get it all, get it all. But for people who are athletic, active, and maybe they do have a little bit more variability in their glucose, an A1C may look falsely high.
Yeah,
I think
that's what
that's
I've heard.
where looking at the glycemic variability on a CGM is really, really important. You can have a higher A1C, and you have two people that say they have a 5.7% A1C, and you give them both CGMs. Their glycemic variability can look really different. So I think that's kind of the benefit of having a CGM. So yes, helpful data, but it's sort of like looking at a still photograph versus watching a movie. And with the CGM, you just get to see where all those gaps are that you don't get to see in a lab office. So yeah, but I think glycemic variability is just coming more into focus as a useful metric. But I will also mention that even with the higher glucose fluctuations in the athletic population, elite and even masters athletes, so over the age of 35, when we compare them to the general population, they don't have any long-term health effects that are poor. They have lower fasting glucose levels. They have whole body heightened insulin sensitivity. And so I do think it is, if you do have a woman who is like, my A1C is creeping up, I'm in this, menopausal life phase, get a fasting insulin, right? Let's see what's actually happening. Or you get a HOMA IR, which is a marker of insulin sensitivity. What's your triglycerides look like?
Right.
Triglyceride over HDL is a wonderful indicator of insulin sensitivity. So
Like the ratio?
yep, the ratio.
Oh.
So it's actually a very good predictor, and it's nice to have because most doctors will test those things. So even if you can't get some of the more specialty tests, like not everyone will test a fasting insulin, not everyone will do a home IR, some people won't even do an advanced lipid profile, but everyone's going to get a triglyceride and an HDL and a lipid panel. And so when you're in a pinch, that's a great indicator for metabolic health and insulin sensitivity.
Is there a range?
Yeah, we like to see a ratio that is less than 1.
Okay.
So you want, triglycerides over HDL and as close to a 1 ratio or lower for that.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, so it is. There's a little tricks, that you can pick up on when you're not able to get exactly what you want.
You mentioned circadian rhythms, and that is something that also gets tossed sometimes for women in this time of life. How do those impact glucose response?
So I like to think of your metabolism as having office hours. So we're going to prefer to digest and regulate earlier in the day. So insulin sensitivity will decline as the day goes on. I think we have to look at it individually, depending on, especially for active populations, when they're exercising. If they're exercising later in the day, we probably don't want to go to bed before we eat something to replenish, right, glycogen stores. So that's a little bit of a nuance, but generally speaking, we want to consume most of our calories earlier in the day. And for women, especially who are maybe struggling with a little bit of a increased insulin resistance, or they're noticing more spikes from eating carbohydrates, eating your carbs earlier in the day paired with protein. And then if you are interested in doing some type of fasting, that or early time restricted eating. So eating, your last meal at least 3 hours before you're kind of hitting the hay and trying to go to sleep can be really helpful. Again, take that into the context of what your overall training schedule is like and things like that, because I think recovering and replenishing, glycogen stores, especially if you're doing a really long workout later in the day, maybe that's, as a triathlete myself, sometimes that's just the way it goes. But yeah, you want to make sure that at least you're keeping that in mind. Or if you're wearing a CGM, you can see what's happening overnight.
Right.
How are you processing what you ate, that kind of thing. So I think, carbs earlier in the day for sure. And then insulin and melatonin kind of have a little bit of an interesting relationship. So eating carbs later in the evening, obviously going to stimulate insulin release, which is going to hinder melatonin. So that's also kind of something that we want to take into account when we're talking about circadian rhythm.
Then why is cookies and milk such a popular bedtime snack?
I love that. I love that bedtime snack. I'm fully on board. I'm fully on board with that. Yeah, but I think too with athletes, we have to talk about sleep, and it's, poor sleep, late night eating. We end up in this cycle that's really harmful for insulin sensitivity, weight loss. I know women who will be doing everything right and they're unfortunately terrible sleepers, or they're just not sleeping well. They're not sleeping through the night. And so when we look at studies, sleep fragmentation, so when people are sleeping, but they're disrupted through the night. So maybe they get 8 hours, but you're waking up, every hour, every 2 hours, and you're not really getting into deep sleep. Those people have 25% higher glucose levels the next day, which is crazy. That's a lot.
Yeah,
That's high.
a lot.
That's high glucose. And when we have high glucose, we don't have metabolic flexibility. Glucose is always going to be our primary fuel source. So when we look at the hierarchy of fuels, if we have high glucose, the body's like, hey, I have all this excess glucose. I'm going to burn this. I'm not going to tap into my fat stores because I don't need to, right? The liver is releasing glucose because it's stressed. They think it needs additional fuel, which we don't. So that can really play into weight loss resistance and things like that too. And then for people that are just not sleeping enough, they're getting 4 or 6 hours a night, they see an increase on average of 40% on their glucose levels and a 25% reduction in insulin sensitivity. So both are bad.
Yeah.
we have to start focusing on sleep in this population, especially for active people.
Yeah, no, 100%. 100%. And it is, I'm very sensitive to the fact that it can be difficult and there's a lot of work to be done sometimes. And there are lots of people that can help you with different therapies, hormonal and otherwise. It's just worth putting in the effort because sleep is such a big cornerstone.
It takes a village, I think, sometimes with sleep.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's a hard pill to swallow because it feels so much out of our control. And I think especially for this member population, maybe they're struggling with, hot flashes, or, it's just not comfortable, or, they feel like nothing they do is working. And so I think trying a variety of things and letting people know that there are lots of different modalities to try. It's not just nutrition, right? We're not alone in this space. Acupuncture, massage, yoga, therapy, super important.
All of it. That's very true. Let's talk about some of the maybe simple things that one of the things that I discovered was the power of a good walk after a meal, which is so funny because that's another, like, when you go to Europe, everyone goes out to see and be seen after dinner, right? Everyone goes for a walk, and wow, that had such a big impact.
It does. It's crazy how the impact of being sedentary is so profound. I know people even standing up after eating has an impact versus just sitting still.
Wow.
After eating. Yeah, I would say probably within 30 minutes of eating your meal, depending on the content of the meal, you want to be walking. 10, 15 minutes. You can walk around your house. You can go up and down your stairs, or just stay standing. Just don't sit down, right? If you have a standing desk at work, or, something like that. But I think the impact of being sedentary on insulin sensitivity, even if we have like the weekend warriors or people that get a workout in at the end of the day or in the beginning of the day, and then they're sitting all day, that's super detrimental. And we think we're doing a great job, right? We're like, I got my hour spin class in the morning or whatever. And don't get me wrong, wonderful.
I get it.
Right? Yep. It's targeted exercise is so, so important, but we can't forget just the impact of getting up and moving every hour. Go do 10 push-ups an hour. Go do, like 10 squats, 10, hold a plank for a minute, whatever. Just get up and move. Don't sit on your butt for 8 hours a day. Set a timer, make an excuse, get up from your desk if you're sitting. Sitting's the new smoking. I've heard that. I believe it. It's, and I think where we are in a society that just continues to prize working hard and sitting at your desk and working long hours, and we're doing our metabolism a disservice. You got to get up and walk around.
Yeah.
It's
100% agree.
It's so simple, just get your steps in, get the steps up.
Do you have thoughts on arranging the order of your food?
Yeah, meal sequencing. It feels funny. I know people that are like, that cannot possibly have an impact, but there actually have been several small studies done around meal sequencing and food pairing. And, you've probably heard the glucose goddess. She talks about putting clothes on your carbs and things like that. And we do actually see this work pretty well. So consuming protein before your starchy carbs, it does promote your GLP-1. So the glucagon-like peptide 1, and that's going to reduce glucagon secretion from your liver, which is what raises your glucose. So it suppresses that. And then it also delays gastric emptying. So you're going to see less of a spike because glucose is hitting your bloodstream at a slower rate. And so you see a gentler response, and then you feel full for longer. That being said, that's protein. We also know it works with non-starchy vegetables. So eating something that has fiber in it first. This one to me makes it's kind of like, is there a confounding variable because fiber is known to slow down, right? The kind of carb you're eating is just kind of the digestion of your carbs is going to slow down. So, but we do know that they have lower post-meal glucose and insulin levels when they eat this way compared to when they don't do meal sequencing. So I find that to be a wonderful experiment when somebody feels like they're eating something that they really love. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that you can keep that food in your diet. This is not a restrictive tool. This should be a freedom tool. We want to learn what's good for you and maybe what's going to work maybe less often, or when you pair it with something, or maybe we need to play around with timing, size, portion. Let's try meal sequencing. Let's try apple cider vinegar, before your meal. Lots of different little glucose hacks that can allow people to continue to enjoy the foods that they like.
How does apple cider vinegar work? Do we know that?
Yes. Apple cider vinegar contains acetic acid, which is known to reduce glucose levels. So there have been several small studies, but I've seen some that say up to like 40% reduction in post-meal glucose with apple cider vinegar. Long-term use is also associated with lower fasting glucose over time. I think it's like 8 or 12 weeks. That being said, the capsules don't work as well because you need the acetic acid actually present at the time when you're eating the meal. I think Enzymedica has a capsule that has acetic acid present, but I'm always a fan of if you can tolerate the taste and you can do like a teaspoon or two in some water, go that route. It's just easier. And Bragg's apple cider vinegar is great. Just keep it in your pantry. It's easy.
Are you familiar, as we wrap up this conversation, with the high carb fueling revolution going on in endurance sports? And what are your thoughts on if that has some knock-on effects we might not be thinking about?
Yeah, I like periodization of fueling. So I think the super high carb trend in endurance sports, it sort of pushes the limit of carb absorption. I think probably up to 90 grams of carbs per hour is doable for a lot of people. Once you get up to like 120 plus grams, I think, unless you're really training that way, I think that's hard on your gut, and you maybe not be absorbing everything as well. So I think it is very personalized, but think about metabolic flexibility. You want your body to be in fat burning mode sometimes too. So if we're doing day-to-day really, really high carb, I think the jury is still out on how useful this is for everybody. I think that it's important to make sure that you are, for performance nutrition, for endurance athletes, 5 to 7 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight per day. If you're doing ultra, closer to 12, hitting your protein, that kind of thing, making sure you're getting those micronutrients that can be of concern for women, especially iron, calcium, vitamin D, magnesium, creatine, I love for women, super important. But glycogen storage, we only have so much room,
Yeah.
right? 400 to 600 grams. And if we're doing way more than that, what's happening, right? Are we so active that we're using that? Is it being stored? So I think I think the jury is still out. I think that for racing, it probably makes sense, making sure that you have that fuel available. But I think that's where the value of a tool like the CGM comes into play, right? If you want to try that, go for it. See how your body responds. What's
Yeah.
your glucose? What's it looking like? What's it looking like on your workouts? Are you having reactive hypoglycemia? What's your glucose like overnight? Do your DEXA scan, right? What's your lean mass like? What's your body fat like? So lots of different inputs into my thoughts on that. But I will say I'll be interested to see if we get some long-term, RCTs on something like that. But we've
Yeah.
seen it, right? We saw the high fat, low carb athlete trend roll through. Now we're sort of seeing the flip side of that. So, but I'm never going to say if it works really well for an N equals 1, I'm like, hey, more power to you. You go,
Yeah.
you go, and it's working well for you. But probably not something I'm recommending to everybody that I'm working with in this population.
Very fair. Well, this has been brilliant, Liz. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to make sure that we expressed?
I do think so. I'm always a food first person. However, I will say that I like to pay special attention to creatine, especially for this age group. It does enhance power and strength. It holds up in women in this population. We're seeing faster recovery. We have more efficiency in resistance training. In postmenopausal women, creatine supplementation with resistance training actually increases bone mineral density. It can also increase cognitive function, so things that we care about as we're aging. And so I do think that looking into safe supplementation, it's safe long term. I think if we were going to talk about one supplement for active women in this age group, creatine is probably my number one across the board as being something that's really, really helpful.
And are you looking at that 5 grams a day?
Yeah, so you can do a loading phase, although that is not required, but usually 5 grams of creatine monohydrate. You can do an optional loading phase of 20 grams a
A lot
day.
of women complain about that,
Yeah,
man. We've
5 to
got,
7,
yeah,
the water retention, things
yeah.
like that. You get the same benefit as just doing a maintenance dose. I also think timing is super flexible, so the jury is still out. They just say around exercise is usually, and consistency. So take it at the same time every day, whether that's
Okay.
pre or post. Although it is not set in stone, as to when is the optimal time to take it yet. I hope
Right.
we'll know that soon. But yeah, same time every day, just be consistent with it. I think it's a great,
Perfect.
yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time,
Thank you
and
so much.
you
This was
explained some things that I had not heard explained that way. So at this point in the game, I always appreciate that.
Yeah.
And
No, absolutely. The hour flew by. My gosh, it goes fast.
yeah. Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with Jan Wanklin to talk all about soft tissue care, active release techniques, and all the ways we can take care of our soft tissues to stay in the game. She was a real delight to talk to about this. So come on back for that one. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause. And please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends. And please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.